It's a crisp morning on the plains of Eastern Europe. The grass is wet with dew, the kind that clings to your boots and slows your steps, just enough to make you notice. Overhead, the sky is an endless sheet of gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that promise rain later in the day. It looks calm, almost ordinary, until you realize that the horizon is lined with armored vehicles, troop carriers, and missile launchers, all facing east. This isn't a border skirmish or a military parade. It's a NATO war game, but not just any drill. This is the one exercise that Russian military planners watch with cold, unblinking attention. In their view, this is not a game at all. It's a rehearsal for the unthinkable. Officially, the exercise is called Defend a Shield, a massive, multinational military operation involving tens of thousands of troops from over a dozen NATO countries. It's set in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the alliance's frontline states, just miles from the Russian border and the heavily militarized enclave of Kaliningrad. Every move, every simulated strike, every logistical maneuver is being tracked, analyzed, and filed away by Russian intelligence. Why? Because the scenario NATO is running is one Moscow has feared for decades, a rapid reinforcement of Eastern Europe in the event of a Russian incursion. In other words, how fast can NATO get a credible, fully armed combat force into position before Russian armor rolls too far west? NATO conducts dozens of exercises every year. Air defense drills, naval patrols, small-scale infantry training. Russia complains about most of them, but Defender's Shield hits differently. The reason is location, timing, and scale. The location is in what Russia calls its near abroad, the belt of former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states it once controlled and still considers part of its strategic buffer zone. Kaliningrad, bristling with advanced S-400 air defense systems, counter-ballistic missiles, and a permanent garrison of elite troops, sits like a loaded gun pointed at NATO's flank. Every tank moving in Poland, every aircraft sortie from Lithuania, is watched through that lens. The timing comes amid the highest tensions between Moscow and NATO since the Cold War. The war in Ukraine has hardened front lines and rhetoric alike. Russian officials warn daily about red lines and unacceptable provocations. For them, staging a war game within artillery range of Russian soil isn't a neutral event, it's a message. And the scale is staggering. Over 40,000 troops, hundreds of aircraft, dozens of warships, and thousands of armored vehicles. This isn't symbolic flag waving. It's a logistical stress test, moving divisions across borders, setting up supply lines, coordinating air and ground assaults in real time. To Russia, it looks like the infrastructure for war being built right on their doorstep. Inside Russia's Ministry of Defense, they don't see Defender's Shield as just a drill. The doctrine taught in their military academies warns that large-scale exercises near their borders could be a disguise for an actual invasion, the so-called Maskirovka fear, named after the Russian art of military deception. In their history books, the disasters came when they underestimated such moves. In 1941, Nazi Germany staged massive troop movements and claimed they were training exercises. Days later, Operation Barbarossa began, catching Soviet forces off guard. That trauma runs deep. Today's Russian generals would rather overreact to a drill than risk being blindsided. That's why every time NATO runs something like Defender's Shield, Russia responds in kind. Snap inspections of their own forces, missile drills in Kaliningrad, bomber patrols over the Baltic Sea. It's not just posturing, it's their version of readiness insurance. On the NATO side, the official line is simple. This is about deterrence. The exercise is designed to prove that if any NATO member is attacked, reinforcements will arrive fast enough and in large enough numbers to make aggression too costly to attempt. In practice, this means perfecting the logistics of reinforcement corridors, routes by land, sea, and air that connect Western Europe's main bases to the Eastern Front. German rail networks moving tanks into Poland. USC, 17 cargo planes landing in Riga and Vilnius. British naval convoys escorting supply ships through the Baltic. It also means testing multi-domain operations, integrating cyber defense, satellite surveillance, and electronic warfare into the same battle space as traditional armor and infantry. The scenario might involve simulated Russian jamming of GPS, fake cyber attacks on NATO's command systems, or electronic disruption of aircraft communications. In other words, it's a rehearsal for fighting in a modern, hybrid war environment where missiles aren't the only weapons. Make no mistake, Defend a Shield isn't being staged in a vacuum. It's as much about sending a message as it is about testing capabilities. That message is twofold. To Moscow, NATO can mass combat power on its eastern flank quickly, decisively, and in numbers Russia would have to think twice about challenging. To NATO members themselves, that the alliance is more than words on paper. Article 5, the promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, only works if it's backed by the ability to act. For countries like Latvia and Estonia, who remember life under Soviet rule, this kind of demonstration is more than symbolic. It's existential reassurance. Defender's Shield doesn't unfold like a single Hollywood-style battle. It's a carefully choreographed sequence of phases, each designed to compress weeks of real-world escalation into days of simulated conflict. It begins with the rapid reinforcement phase. In the scenario briefed to NATO commanders, an unnamed aggressor state has massed troops near a NATO ally's border, with intelligence suggesting an incursion could happen within 72 hours. The order goes out to reinforce the front, and that's when the logistics machine roars to life. In Germany, rail cars are loaded with Leopard 2 tanks and armored infantry fighting vehicles. In the Netherlands, heavy transport ships take on ammunition pallets, fuel bladders, and field rations. Across the Atlantic, US C-17 and C-5 cargo aircraft begin lifting off from bases like Dover and Charleston, their cavernous holds packed with Humvees, artillery pieces, and mobile radar units. The clock is the real enemy here. NATO's goal is to prove it can move massive amounts of combat power east before an aggressor can lock down its gains. Russian planners, in turn, scrutinize every movement, every timestamp, measuring how quickly NATO can respond if the Baltics are threatened. Once those reinforcements arrive, the exercise shifts into establishing the front line. Multinational brigades take up positions, blending units from different countries into a single defensive wall. A U.S. armored company might be wedged between a Polish mechanized battalion and a German Panzergrenadier unit, with communications networks linked, command posts set up, and reconnaissance drones circling overhead. This is the test of interoperability, whether troops from different nations, speaking different languages and using different equipment, can function as one fighting force under pressure. For Moscow, seeing that wall of unified NATO troops positioned just miles from its territory is the moment where drill and danger begin to blur. Then comes the hybrid warfare phase, where the battlefield extends beyond physical space. NATO planners inject cyber and electronic warfare challenges into the exercise. Convoys lose GPS guidance, simulating jamming attacks. Command networks are hit with fake cyber intrusions, forcing officers to switch to backup communications. Pilots are confronted with simulated radar interference. These injects are designed to prepare NATO forces for the kind of hybrid war environment they'd likely face against Russia, a place where a missile strike might be preceded by a blackout, a bank hack, or a swarm of misinformation on social media. For observers in Moscow, these scenarios are just as concerning as the tanks and artillery. They show that NATO isn't just rehearsing a ground war. It's preparing for a full-spectrum confrontation where the digital battlefield is as critical as the physical one. While NATO runs its drills, Russia runs its counters. As Defender's Shield unfolds, Russian forces in Kaliningrad and western Russia snap into high alert. S-400 missile batteries go active, tracking every aircraft that enters their engagement zones. Iskander missile units practice rapid deployment drills, rehearsing strikes on hypothetical NATO staging areas. Su-35 and MiG-31 fighters scramble for patrols along the borders, sometimes flying close enough to NATO aircraft to trigger tense cockpit-to-cockpit moments. The Russian Navy steps up activity in the Baltic Sea, shadowing NATO ships and deploying submarines to monitor Allied naval movements. On the home front, state-controlled media frames Defender's Shield as proof that NATO is preparing to invade. News anchors speak in grave tones, showing footage of NATO armor rolling through Polish countryside, implying it's a prelude to a first strike. This serves a dual purpose, rallying domestic support for increased military readiness, and justifying any countermeasures Russia takes in response. In Moscow's strategic calculus, every NATO drill is an intelligence opportunity. Analysts pore over satellite images, watching how NATO units deploy, how quickly they resupply, where their weaknesses might be. The real game is less about the scripted scenarios and more about the unscripted details, the bottlenecks in rail transport, the time it takes to unload a ship, the coordination between air and ground elements. In this shadow contest, every exercise is also an audition, showing the other side exactly what you can and can't do under pressure. And here's the dangerous truth. In a high-tension environment, the line between a war game and the real thing can be paper thin. One misread maneuver, one radar blip mistaken for an incoming strike, one fighter pilot who pushes a little too close, and the script could change instantly. That's why, for all its talk of readiness and deterrence, Defender Shield carries a risk baked into its design. It's not just practicing for war. It's playing war on a board where the opponent is watching every move, ready to respond in kind, and the pieces are real soldiers, real ships, and real missiles. In the end, the real purpose of Defender Shield is both obvious and unspoken. It's a signal, a test, and a gamble. To NATO members on the eastern flank, it's proof that the alliance will stand by them when the pressure comes. To Moscow, it's a reminder that the West can and will marshal overwhelming force if provoked. But the gamble lies in the assumption that both sides will keep it as a drill, that no one will miscalculate, overreact, or decide that the best way to avoid being surprised is to strike first. History has shown that wars don't always start with grand declarations. Sometimes, they start with an exercise that was never meant to be anything more than practice. Sometimes, the rehearsal becomes the opening act. And that's why, every time NATO rolls out Defender Shield on Russia's doorstep, the world holds its breath, because the one drill Moscow fears most is also the one that, in the wrong set of circumstances, could light the match it was meant to prevent.